the summer of 2018, a small town in Oklahoma was rocked by tragedy. An 18-year-old student was found dead in her grandfather's home. The investigation quickly revealed that shortly before her death, the girl had confided in a friend about a strange, intimate, and humiliating relationship with her guardian. The family's story turned out to be much darker than it initially appeared. The family's story began with a series of events that initially seemed like a chain of unfortunate coincidences, but later coalesced into a dark picture. At the center of this story was 18-year-old Susan Harper, a seemingly ordinary girl from the quiet town of Blakeson, Oklahoma. Before the tragedy, her life was no different from that of her peers. High school, a part-time job at a local diner, and occasional trips with friends to a neighboring town. But her family had long been bearing a heavy burden. Susan's father, Michael Harper, was a truck driver. In 2010, he died in circumstances initially considered an accident. He was found in the cab with a gunshot wound, but police soon determined it was murder committed by gangsters with whom he had long-standing conflicts over debts. The case was never solved. There were no witnesses, and the pool of suspects was too broad. After her husband's death, Susan's mother, Linda Harper, struggled to hold the family together. She worked as a nurse at a local hospital, but her salary was barely enough to live on. In 2012, Linda disappeared without a trace. She left for work that morning and never returned home that evening. Her car was found on the outskirts of town, the door unlocked, and her bag and phone inside. Investigators considered theories ranging from abduction to voluntary abandonment, but her body was never found. The case of her disappearance remains open. After this, Susan and her younger brother Tim lived with distant relatives, but in 2014, their paternal grandfather, Walter Harmon, was officially appointed guardian of the children. At the time, he was 62 years old, retired, a former mechanic, widowed, and a man with a reputation for quiet and reserved behavior. At first, life with her grandfather seemed stable. Walter provided for the children, supervised their studies, and maintained order in the house. Neighbors described him as a strict but caring guardian. Susan was considered a reserved but diligent student at school, with no troubles or discipline issues. In 2016, her brother Tim left for college in another state. From that moment on, Susan and her grandfather were left alone. No one noticed anything unusual at the time. Susan was finishing high school, preparing to enter a local college, and working part-time. Walter remained her only relative and source of support. According to acquaintances, their life seemed completely normal until 2017. Her grandfather helped Susan with her studies, gave her pocket money, and sometimes picked her up after work or school. Neighbors saw them together at city events, parades, fairs, and school graduations. No one noticed that they had become very withdrawn and barely interacted with other families. The turning point came in the spring of 2017. According to Susan's classmate, it was then that she first noticed the girl becoming nervous, often interrupting conversations when her grandfather called, and trying to avoid discussing family matters with her friends. Teachers noted that her grades had dropped, even though she had previously been a steady student. Later, the investigation established that it was during this period that her grandfather began limiting her interactions with peers. Susan attended parties less and less, stopped participating in school activities, and abandoned plans to attend college out of state. In explanations to a friend, she said her grandfather didn't want her to leave him alone, but this didn't arouse suspicion at the time. By the fall of 2017, Susan was essentially living a life completely subordinated to her grandfather's schedule. He controlled her finances, decided where she would work, and even restricted her phone and social media use. All of this was then explained as a concern for her safety. Given her father's murder and her mother's disappearance, such caution seemed logical, but it was this period that investigators would later identify as the time when Walter Harmon began to develop an emotional dependence on his granddaughter, which would eventually take on a much darker character. After 2017, changes in Walter Harmon's behavior became noticeable even to the few people who interacted with Susan. At first, they seemed minor. The grandfather began calling his granddaughter more often, demanding she tell him where she was and who she was spending time with. He justified this by citing concern and safety, citing her mother's disappearance and the dangers of the small town. But gradually, his control began to extend beyond simple guardianship. Testimony from Susan's friends would later indicate that she had almost completely stopped visiting them. Whereas previously her grandfather had simply waited for her at home, he now began arriving at her work, sometimes unannounced, standing at the door and checking on her as she finished her shift. Soon, he demanded that she stop associating with several friends whom he considered a bad influence. By the end of 2017, her grandfather had complete control over his granddaughter's finances. All purchases went through him. He even took care of her cell phone bill, citing convenience. Susan's phone was a basic one, without constant internet access, which her grandfather also explained as a cost-saving measure. Investigators would later establish that it was then that he began to isolate her from her peers and teachers. Susan stopped participating in school projects and quit art classes, which she had loved since childhood. She explained this by saying she had a lot of chores and no time. But neighbors noticed Walter not only didn't stop her from studying, but he himself insisted that she finish high school. He also insisted that she go to work immediately after graduation rather than go to college. Psychologists involved in the investigation would later point to a clear pattern of emotional isolation. Initially, her grandfather overprotected Susan, picking her up after work, driving her around, and giving her money for clothes and food. Gradually, he made it so she had no one but him. In the spring of 2018, several months before the tragedy, Susan's grandfather began demanding more and more time at home. He even instituted a rule that she had to be home by a certain time, even if her shift ended late. One evening, according to a coworker, Susan came home upset and admitted that her grandfather had told her, "Either you listen to me or I leave, and you'll have to support yourself." This conversation was the first warning sign. Walter made it clear for the first time that his care might fade if his granddaughter didn't comply with his demands. Susan didn't have her own home, a full-time job, or any real financial independence. The situation gradually escalated. First, there were harsh remarks from her grandfather, then restrictions on communication, then demands that she spend more time with him, giving up meetings with friends and part-time jobs. By the summer of 2018, Susan had stopped even mentioning her future plans. Previously, she talked about college and wanted to study medicine like her mother. Now, according to her friend, she simply brushed it off, saying her grandfather was against it. The investigation would later establish that it was during this period that her grandfather began to emotionally pressure Susan, creating a situation in which she felt completely dependent on him. This wasn't sudden. He acted slowly, so that she had no strength or resources left to resist. All this will lead to events that will become known only after her death. In the summer of 2018, the situation inside Walter Harmon's house changed completely. According to neighbors, they had previously seen Susan on the street, in stores, and sometimes with friends. Now she almost never left home without her grandfather. Whereas previously, he'd simply meet her after work, now he remained nearby all the time, even on short walks. One day, as a colleague at the diner recounted, Susan confessed her grandfather began to get irritated if she was even 10 minutes late. At first he said he was worried, but soon his tone took on a commanding tone. According to investigators, around July 2018, Walter first openly posed the question, "Either we live the way I want, or I leave and you support yourself." At the time, Susan had no savings or stable employment. Her salary at the diner barely covered her allowance. Her grandfather paid the rest. Susan's friend later testified during questioning that the girl appeared depressed and frightened. She tried to talk to her grandfather about college, about the possibility of studying and working simultaneously, but he categorically refused to discuss the matter. Walter insisted that studying was a waste of time and money, and that home is what matters. The investigation will establish that it was then that her grandfather began limiting her contact, even with her closest friends. Several times he called Susan while she was visiting a friend and demanded that she return home immediately. At first, she made excuses, then simply stopped visiting. According to neighbors, the grandfather began to control even his granddaughter's purchases. While he used to give her money for clothes and food, he now bought everything himself, choosing things without her input. This control gradually became more and more strict, and the girl had less and less control over even the smallest details of her life. In August 2018, Susan told a coworker that her grandfather had given her a condition she didn't want to discuss. The coworker didn't understand what was meant at the time, but she described Susan as looking confused and depressed. Psychologists who reviewed the case materials later noted that Walter consistently created a situation of emotional and domestic isolation. The girl lost her usual social circle, lost her financial independence, and her future plans were ruined. According to the investigation, it was in August that the grandfather began openly saying he wouldn't spend money just like that unless Susan did what he thought was right. This became a direct form of blackmail. In the weeks before the tragedy, Susan spent almost all her time at home. Neighbors reported hearing arguments. One evening, a few days before her death, a neighbor saw her leave the house in tears and sit on the porch, but then returned after talking with her grandfather. The investigation revealed that it was during this period that Walter's pressure reached its peak. The girl found herself completely isolated and had no one to turn to for help. September 2018 marked a turning point in this story. It was then that Susan first decided to tell someone outside the home about what was happening. According to investigators, the first person she confided in was her close friend, Mallory Stevens, a classmate of hers since elementary school. According to Mallory, Susan called her on the evening of September 14th and asked to meet. They met at the diner where Susan worked after her shift ended. Susan looked depressed and barely made eye contact. At first, she talked about trivial matters, school, work, but then admitted that being at home was becoming unbearable. According to her, her grandfather began giving her ultimatums. He said he was tired of supporting her and that either they live as a family or he abandons her to her fate. Susan clarified that this wasn't just about household chores, but that he demanded that she be his everything. Mallory later admitted during questioning that she didn't understand the full gravity of the situation at the time. She tried to convince Susan to see a school counselor, or at least a teacher she trusted, but the girl refused. She was afraid her grandfather would find out and then actually kick her out of the house. A few days later, Susan met with Mallory again. This time she said her grandfather had started threatening to take away her money and housing if she didn't do what he said. She said her grandfather spoke calmly, without shouting, but with such confidence that she sensed he wasn't just talking. Investigators later determined that her grandfather prevented her from seeking full-time employment, refused to allow her to register a bank card in his name, and even confiscated her documents for safekeeping. Susan had virtually no way to leave. She had nowhere to go and no money to rent a place to live. At the end of September, she told Mallory she couldn't live like this anymore. Her friend tried to convince her to tell the police, but Susan refused. She explained that she had no evidence and that she would be held accountable by the word of a grown man with a good reputation and a stable income. According to the case file, it was then that Susan began to show the first signs of severe depression. Teachers at the school where she was finishing her senior year said she had stopped turning in assignments, was frequently absent, and seemed tired. One teacher tried to talk to her, but Susan said she had problems at home and would handle things on her own. Neighbors later reported that the grandfather became even more withdrawn. He stopped talking to them, wouldn't let anyone into the house, and often kept the windows closed even during the day. Several people saw Susan come out into the yard only late at night, sometimes sitting on a bench and alone for long periods. On October 5, 2018, an incident occurred that investigators identified as pivotal. Susan came to Mallory and said that her grandfather was demanding things from her that she could no longer do. She didn't say the exact words, but her friend understood that she was talking about something beyond everyday issues. Mallory offered to let her stay the night, but Susan declined, saying she was afraid of her grandfather's reaction if she didn't return home. During this period, Susan stopped planning for the future. A friend said they used to discuss college, work, and travel dreams, but now she only said, "First, I need to get through this fall." According to investigators, on October 10th, Susan searched online for information about shelters for girls and free legal aid, but did not complete any calls. Her browser history shows several searches related to psychological support and crisis centers. All this indicated that she realized the seriousness of the situation, but did not know how to get out of it. On October 15, 2018, Susan met with Mallory again. She said she couldn't take the pressure anymore and wanted to tell someone officially, but the next day, she didn't show up for school. 2 days later, she was found dead in her grandfather's house. On October 17, 2018, at 7:40 a.m., Walter Harmon's neighbor called the police. She noticed the door to the house ajar and Walter sitting on the porch, pale and motionless. He did not answer the neighbor's questions. When police arrived, they found Susan Harper's body inside the house. According to the coroner's official report, death occurred approximately 12 hours before her discovery. A suicide note was found at the scene, Its handwriting matched samples from Susan's school notebooks, and forensic experts confirmed its authenticity. In the note, she wrote that she couldn't live under this pressure anymore and that she was tired of everything. She did not provide any specific accusations or details. The investigation immediately questioned Walter Harmon. He denied pressuring his granddaughter. He said she was emotionally unstable after her parents' death, and he did everything he could to help her. However, as the investigation progressed, evidence began to emerge that contradicted the grandfather's account. Susan's friend, Mallory Stevens, provided correspondence in which the girl wrote about the impossible conditions at home. In several messages, she directly stated that she was afraid of her grandfather and couldn't leave because she had nowhere to live. School staff reported that Susan had been appearing depressed in recent months, often arriving to class sleep-deprived, and had stopped interacting with her classmates. Her English teacher said she offered her support and the opportunity to speak with a school psychologist, but Susan declined, saying it wouldn't change anything. The police requested financial records. It turned out that Susan had no personal account or savings. All the money she earned at the diner went to her grandfather for general expenses. According to her colleagues, she sometimes asked them for small loans, which seemed odd considering her grandfather provided her with housing and food. The investigation paid special attention to Walter's surroundings. Neighbors said he had always been a withdrawn person, but in the last year, he had become especially irritable and rarely spoke to anyone. One neighbor claimed to have heard screams coming from the house, but couldn't make out the words. Search queries related to psychological support, as well as information about shelters and crisis centers, were found on Susan's computer. This confirmed the theory that she had considered leaving home but hadn't yet decided. From a legal standpoint, proving Walter's direct guilt proved difficult. The suicide note contained no specific accusations. Susan's friend insisted the girl had spoken of blackmail and pressure, but these were all verbal confessions without witnesses. Investigators considered pursuing charges of incitement to suicide, but the district attorney declared the evidence insufficient. Walter Harmon declined interviews with the press and, after the case was closed, sold his house and left town. A report on Susan's psychological condition was preserved in the school archives. It stated that she showed signs of severe depression, but she had not seen a specialist or sought professional help. The case was officially closed in January 2019 as a suicide. The police report stated, "There is no direct evidence of criminality leading to Susan Harper's death. However, the circumstances of her life in recent months were extremely difficult and required the intervention of social services." After the case was closed, several meetings were held in the city to discuss the need for increased support for teenagers facing difficult family circumstances. Teachers at Susan's school said no one expected such an outcome and that the girl appeared quiet and withdrawn, but didn't show any signs that anyone would have recognized in time. Walter himself never returned to Blakeson. According to local media, he moved to a neighboring state and lived there alone until his death in 2021. Susan Harper's story remains in police archives as a tragic case that has never been resolved.